Supporters of Jair Bolsonaro gathered in São Paulo on September the 7th to celebrate Brazil's Independence Day. And in many ways, it was business as usual. They idolized Elon Musk, complained about the Supreme Court, bashed leftist President Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva and establishment media, and supported Israel to the detriment of Palestine. But there was one big elephant in the room: Pablo Marçal, a candidate for mayor of São Paulo who has become a hot name within Bolsonarism despite not being formally endorsed by Mr. Bolsonaro. And this week, we will discuss how Pablo Marçal is changing the Brazilian conservative movement and Brazilian politics as a whole. My name is Gustavo Ribeiro, I'm the editor-in-chief of the Brazilian Report, and this is Explaining Brazil.
If you like Explaining Brazil, you should subscribe to our website, The Brazilian Report, which is the journalistic engine behind this podcast. Or you can go the extra mile and make a donation to our newsroom, tipping our journalists via our Buy Me a Coffee page. And you can also subscribe to our Buy Me a Coffee fan page, pledging a monthly contribution to our newsroom in exchange for exclusive content that you won't find anywhere else. Our Buy Me a Coffee subscribers are Cristina Viu, Andrei Novoseltsev, Wild Rice, Jaciara de Oliveira, Carson Allen, Gabriel Luca, Pan Ludwig, Leslie Seal, Mark Hillary, Louise Renz, Erwan Menais, Aaron Berger, Kars Vrieswick, Alistair Townsend, Miller Renarcido, Peter Abramson, David Dixon, Jose Ozi Stankovic, Emerging Market Muser, Anna Lund, Peter Suffren, Anderson da Silva, and someone who chose to remain anonymous. And our Buy Me a Coffee members come from all over the world, so please, if we're butchering the pronunciation of your name, please send us an email. If you too believe in the importance of independent journalism, and if you want to hear your name on our podcast, go to buymeacoffee.com/Brazilian Report and subscribe to one of our membership levels. Click on buymeacoffee.com/Brazilian Report to find out more.
This week I'm joined by political scientist Beatriz Rey, who is also a columnist for the Brazilian Report. Beatriz, glad to have you back on the show.
It's a pleasure to be back. Thank you for inviting me.
Beatriz, before we get into the interview, I'd like to present Pablo Marçal for those who don't know him just yet. And just to make it short, he's a Tony Robbins-like figure who presents himself as a self-made business success. He has tried to run for president in 2018, but didn't make it into the ballot. In 2022, he ran for a House seat to represent the state of São Paulo and obtained almost 250,000 votes, which would have made him the 11th best voted candidate if electoral courts had not excluded him from the race due to issues with his party. Marçal is also linked to many people with several criminal accusations, and he has started the race as a wildcard. He defends many of the values that are espoused by Jair Bolsonaro and his supporters, and more importantly, he deploys a social media strategy that seems to be a version of the Bolsonaro campaign in 2018 on steroids. That has propelled Pablo Marçal into a three-way tie with the two men who everyone thought were the favorite to win the race for mayor of São Paulo: Ricardo Nunes, the incumbent mayor and official Bolsonaro candidate, and Guilherme Boulos, a left-wing congressman endorsed by President Lula. Now, you wrote about Pablo Marçal for the Brazilian Report, and I'd like to start our conversation by asking you to talk a little bit more about Marçal's beliefs and how he connects with voters.
Sure. So in the piece that I wrote, I talk about how Marçal is already crafting his own legacy in Brazilian politics. And the first element of that legacy is the introduction of what we call the prosperity theology, which is a form of religious populism that is rooted in New Pentecostalism, an evangelical movement. And he's bringing that into the political arena. He wrote a book that is called, in Portuguese, I'm translating here, The Bible You Haven't Read. The title, I think, points to where he's going with this. Marçal Marçal believes that the church is irrelevant for you to connect with God. So you don't need to go to church, you don't need to attend church, you don't need to do service. This is very similar, by the way, to how we think about populism in the political arena. Like the institutions don't mediate social relations. The same way here, right? The church doesn't mediate the religion, the relationship you have with God. And he focuses a lot on material success. He thinks that's a divine blessing in the life of those who follow the gospel. In the piece, I quote this article by a scholar named Kate Bowler. She describes this belief as money in the bank, healthy body, a thriving family, and a boundless happiness. When I read this, my first thought was, well, who doesn't want that? Money in the bank, healthy body, a thriving family, and boundless happiness. And the key thing here is that he believes that this material success, for you to achieve it, you just have to believe it, right? If you believe it, you're going to get it, regardless of how, like, where you were born, the conditions under which you were born, if you're poor, if you're not, if you didn't have access to formal education, regardless. It's a matter of just believing it. So Marçal was interviewed by a program in Brazil that's called Roda Viva, which is basically, it puts the person that's being interviewed in the center, and then you have a round table with journalists asking a lot of questions. And one of the journalists asked him how he would combat poverty, which is a serious issue in São Paulo. And his answer was that anybody can leave poverty, as long as that person becomes somebody. So poverty to him is really a state of mind. And I know for a fact that if you look at the outskirts, the periphery of São Paulo, where people struggle to get out of poverty, or they're getting out of poverty and they want this material success that Marçal is telling, this is going to be very appealing to them.
Mm-hmm. No, it's interesting because, Uber sociology here, but when you talk to people that are struggling financially, like Uber drivers or delivery couriers, a lot of them say that they are not very sensitive to anti-poverty discourse, because they say, like, I'm working 7 days a week, doing 2, 3, 4 jobs, and you're talking about aiding people who are not pulling the same kind of effort as I am. So it is something that really rings a bell for that part of the population, right?
Right, and I think in some way it is wrapped around some sort of prejudice, right? And this is something that the movement that Bolsonaro represents does, and I think Marçal is doing the same, that there are people that just benefit from the system without doing anything, and those are the ones who receive social policies such as Bolsa Familia in the national level, right? Even though we have a lot of evidence that that's not how that works, right? The Bolsa Familia actually takes people out of poverty, and once they are out, they're able to thrive by themselves, right? That gives them the tools that they need to get out of the situation in which they are. But I think it's wrapped around this. There is some prejudice there, but there is also the narrative that is very true for a lot of people, that is, they work very hard, and democracy is failing them in all levels in Brazil, right? It's not delivering the things that people want. It's not delivering quality education, quality health. It's not delivering public transportation. People struggle. In a city like São Paulo, people struggle a lot every day. People who go to work and they take like 3 to 4 hours to get to work. They work the whole day, they come back, everything's expensive. So here comes a guy who says, you just have to believe it, and it's going to happen.
Yeah. No, and I mean, talking about this quote unquote proposal for changing the mindset of people in Sao Paulo, that is the kind of thing that has been met with a lot of scorn. And Marçal has been treated in a very condescending manner by politicians, by journalists, many of whom had dismissed him as a joke candidate. but he's proving to be pretty competitive, and he has polled above the 20% mark in each of the past few polls. He's statistically tied with Guilherme Boulos, the strongest name left of center, and with Ricardo Nunes, who is the incumbent. And we know that in Brazil, incumbency bias is a real thing. How has that come to be?
I think a part of it is it's Marçal's own merit, and we can talk about that in a second. I think he brings a style of communication that is very different, but I also think it's a product of the mistakes made by his adversaries, right? So you have a candidate like Guilherme Boulos, who lives in the south of São Paulo, and coincidentally, he lives in the neighborhood where I was born, Campo Limpo. And in Campo Limpo, according to internal polls, he's tied with Marçal. The guy lives in the neighborhood, and he's not able to get the votes in his own neighborhood. You have movements such as the funk movement in São Paulo, the samba movement. They have sided with Ricardo Nunes or Marçal, not with Guilherme Boulos. From what I hear from the Black movement, Guilherme Boulos is also not opening up enough space to hear them as in line with the samba and the funk movement, right? So you have a movement of the social groups that naturally would go to the left, going to the right, or to the extreme right. And you wonder why this is happening. And I think part of the problem is just that the Guilherme Boulos campaign doesn't have any clue about what it's doing. And I think that's true on political strategy, that's true on social media. And then it's natural that you're going to open up space. There's no vacuum in politics. If something is not being occupied, if the space is not being occupied, somebody's going to occupy it, right? And I think that's what Marçal is doing, and to some extent Nunes as well. But he's also gaining traction because you have Nunes is somebody called him a bolacha de cristal the other day. I don't know how to translate. Like he's
insipid.
Dull.
Let's say like it's so for people who have never been to Brazil, it's like a cracker biscuit that is almost tasteless, and I mean you have to put jelly or butter or something to give it any kind of flavor. So yeah, he would be an insipid candidate, and he's someone that people barely knew until this year, right? Because he was elected as a deputy mayor. And he only took office after the mayor died of cancer. But I mean, not only was he unknown, but the few people that knew him for the wrong reasons because he was accused of domestic violence in the past.
And also, he hasn't done a great job as mayor since he took office. A lot of complaints. I was in São Paulo recently, and none of the taxi drivers that I spoke to liked him. So I think that's a sign that people are not necessarily happy with him. And then you also have Tabata Amaral, who is a federal deputy, but she's not known in São Paulo. People don't know her, so she's not competitive. And then you have Datena, who I think is about to resign, to drop out the race. If not,
he's Zé Luiz Datena is like this TV presenter that is the biggest political tease in Brazil, right? Every 4 years, every 2 years, he says, okay, I'm running for office, whether it's the Senate or the mayor's office. But every time he drops out before things get official. Now, his candidacy has been registered, so he can be at the ballot, but of course he can drop out at any time he wants. He has and go back to his TV job, which is very lucrative for him, has been for years.
Very convenient for him. So yeah, I think this scenario gives like a lot of space for Marçal to occupy. You have an insipid incumbent who, despite having the machine to work for him, is not able to, at the very least, untie the race, right? Like he's not in a position. I think anybody could claim to know who will win this election is crazy. It's impossible at this point. We have a three-way tie, and the guy who has the machine, who is the mayor right now, is not unable to pull ahead. And then you have...
No, we cannot even know who is going to be in the runoff, right? Because at this point, I mean, we could have a Boulos runoff with either one of the conservative candidates or a all conservative runoff.
Exactly. It could be Marçal against Nunes. It could be Marçal against Boulos or Nunes against Boulos.
Yeah.
We don't know.
At this point, like we can discuss which is the likeliest scenario, but at this point, all scenarios are within the realm of possibilities.
Yeah, so there's just a lot of space for him to occupy. And what is striking to me is just how much ground the left is losing on the ground. Like, really, when I'm talking about the funk and the samba movements, that when I understood that from the news, I was just appalled. I was like, what is happening? How are they just giving that up? But apparently they are.
Now, I want to go back to this discussion about the left in a bit, but before that, I want to talk about the Marçal phenomenon and the fact that some research, and he appears to prove what some researchers have said about the Bolsonarista movement, that espousing values such as tough on crime policies, anti-abortion views, and this absolutist view on freedom of speech might be more important to the Bolsonaro electorate than actually being endorsed by Jair Bolsonaro. Do you agree with that assessment? Do you think that this Marçal phenomenon proves that, or it's the jury's still out?
Well, there are some researchers from the University of São Paulo on the ground in the event on September 7th, and what they find is that 70% of those who were there who claim to be Bolsonaristas, who claim to support Bolsonaro, they actually prefer Marçal than Bolsonaro's candidate, Ricardo Nunes. And I think, to me, that is related to the fact that Marçal takes Bolsonarismo and pushes it to the extreme. So there was a video that I watched on social media last week that he's talking to a journalist, and I think it's like a 6-minute video, and part of the video is just him holding Bolsonaro accountable, saying, "You're weak. You're not espousing your values strong enough. That's why people are leaving you." And I think he's very smart. Marçal is very smart. He knows what he's doing. So he is projecting himself to be the candidate for Bolsonarismo that is not Bolsonaro. And people are buying it because he's pushing it
more royalist than the king, right?
Exactly. So I think, I think that I think it's more that the values are probably more important to that electorate than the endorsement of Bolsonaro. And I don't think that's a surprise, right? When we think about the 2018 election, I think there we had several phenomena going on in society that Bolsonaro was able to capitalize on, right? The anti-PT movement, the frustration with corruption movement. So he was just the name that was able to capitalize. The values were there, and now there's somebody who's doing a better job than he is.
Now, that you just said, combined with the fact that the September 7th demonstration was 4 times smaller than a February rally commanded by Jair Bolsonaro, does those two things mean that Bolsonarismo is losing grip, that Bolsonaro, is losing grip on Bolsonarism, or I am perhaps reading too much into it?
I think we're reading too much into it. I think, honestly, at this point, there are still people gathering in his name. So I think it's still alive. When we go back to that point, do you remember that point in time where it would be just like 6 people with like a protest sign saying, "Please come back, military dictatorship"? Then I will start to concede that Bolsonarism is dying. But I don't think that's not the case yet. I think it's still there. They're still people together, people.
Yeah, no, I remember in 2017, I guess, covering a demonstration that was just 1,100 people asking for the return of the military. And yes, I mean, when you frame like this, we had at least 45,000 people on Saturday. So yeah, it's still strong. I agree with you.
Yeah.
Now, another major point about Marçal and how he's rattling Brazilian politics, and you mentioned this in your op-ed, is his disruptive, aggressive, and like you said, skillful debating style. Can you talk a little bit about that? Because he has, in his own words, wreak havoc in debates with other candidates, and he has participated in pretty contentious interviews with journalists.
Yeah. So we are used to Bolsonaro, who is not very smart. He struggles with keeping up with discussion, and he has a short temper, and he also doesn't have much in terms of vocabulary or argumentation skills. And we cannot say the same about Marçal. In the piece and the op-ed I wrote, I referred to a concept that it's called heuristic. This concept was defined by political scientist William Riker, and it refers to the art of reshaping political debates in a way that allows actors, politicians, to manipulate the terms of those debates and be successful. And that's exactly what Marçal is doing, right? I mentioned the interview with the several journalists that we had I think it was last week. If you watch it, and to those who speak Portuguese, I encourage them to do so because it is a lesson on how to reframe debates. He is asked
but
questions.
It's painful to watch it, right?
It's painful to watch, but I say that, but it is my job to watch those things, and I'm forced to. But yes, it's not going to be a light time and a light use of your time. But he's asked questions, and again, he responds to every one of those without addressing any of them. He hears the question, and then he reframes the question and the answer in the way that he wants, and he's able to do that in an intelligent way. And what you see over and over is that, like, journalists, they are not sure what to do about that, right? Because they're still in this condescending or arrogant mode or confrontational mode that for Marçal is very easy to deal with. He thrives on that. He gets the arrogant, he gets the condescending behavior, and he reframes it again, and he keeps doing it until, like, if I was a journalist there, I honestly wouldn't know what to do. He's very skillful, and he has the vocabulary, he has the argumentation skills, and he can do that for a long time. And that's the difference from Bolsonaro. At some point, Bolsonaro just says, I don't want to, like, he just leaves. And Marçal doesn't. So I think we're dealing with a different type of politician here. Because when politicians use this heuristic that Riker is talking about, they end up creating new axes of debates. This, of course, can be good, and he cites good examples in his book. But I think in Marçal's case, it's bad because when he's reframing those debates, he always reframes them in terms of ideas that are vague or weak or that cannot deal with the complexity of a city like São Paulo. It's like the idea of constructing a building that is 1 kilometer. I think he has a proposal like that, right? I mean, how would that help São Paulo? And that's one of the main proposals that he's advocating for, right?
Yeah. No, but I mean, you mentioned that journalists are being condescending, they're losing their temper with him, and essentially they're playing on his turf. But how can one lead Marçal out of his comfort zone? Because that's all that interviewing politicians is about, is to removing them from a zone of comfort and actually holding them accountable. But it seems to me that this might be pretty impossible to do with Marçal, because if you are aggressive, he will one up you and make you look stupid. But if you just ask him regular questions, he has been pretty clear in saying that he doesn't want to answer journalists' questions. He just wants to use the airtime to showcase his messaging the way he fits him.
I think that's the $1 million question right now, how to deal with them, right? In my opinion, the question is, it precedes that, the real question precedes that one is, should he allow to be a candidate, given that he has been convicted and that he has like all his curriculum is not the one that, if we take the Ficha Limpa law, I don't know how you're translating that,
clean slate law.
Clean slate law, he wouldn't pass that test, right? Because even when he's confronted,
actually, I think he would, because his conviction was tossed due to the statute of limitations. So
right.
I mean, he would. It's more of a matter of why someone who is allied with many people who have alleged links with organized crime, someone who was convicted of scamming people, even if that conviction was later tossed due to technicalities, why he has grown to become this popular. I mean, we're talking about the biggest city in the land. We have also 9 million voters in São Paulo, and at least like 2 million voters according to the polls. And of course, the polls have gotten everything wrong in the past few years, but according to the polls, like 2 million people would be ready to vote for him. It's pretty remarkable.
It is, and I think that this is a very difficult question, and it is. This discussion mirrors the one that we have about how to deal with fascists in democratic systems, right? It's very similar. I'm not calling him a fascist, but I'm just saying that the logic is similar. What should you do? Should you allow him to run and kill democracy from within if he's elected, or he's already doing it in the process of running? So I think political science can be very instructive here. We think that for democracy to thrive, there has to be some level of non-democratic institutions working to preserve it, right? I've seen a lot of people argue that he should be allowed to run, that if he's not supposed to be mayor, that the people will vote him out. And I don't think it's as simple as that. I think the founding fathers in the US were very concerned about the vote. Sometimes people don't vote well, and we need to have that. Sometimes they might vote for a populist demagogue, right? That can happen, and there has to be some sort of defense from the democratic system, and that defense is not always going to be democratic. Sometimes it's going to be an anti-democratic or non-majoritarian, let me put it that way, institution that would safeguard and protect us from people like Marçal. That is, in the context of this election, that doesn't exist, unfortunately. But in my opinion, he should be allowed to be a candidate. I think the debate in which Datena left his booth and went to face him physically, that is a line that we shouldn't be crossing, and it has already been crossed.
Yeah. Now, I wrote for the Brazilian Report that for Mr. Bolsonaro, probably the worst outcome in the São Paulo election is actually not a victory of the left, but rather a race in which a right-wing politician that is not endorsed by him wins, because that would become a blueprint for right-wing candidates to rally Bolsonarista support without necessarily bending the knee to the former president. Do you think this is a fair assessment, or have I gotten it all wrong?
No, I think this is very accurate. I share the same concern. I think he already did that. He already set the blueprint, and I think that's what my op-ed is about. He's leaving a legacy that is not going to be restricted to São Paulo, regardless of whether he wins or not, regardless of whether he goes to the runoff or not. I think what is clear to me at this point is that Bolsonaro is not very smart. Had he been smarter, I think he would have been reelected. And I think Marçal is showing us that the combination of capitalizing on the values that seem to be floating in Brazilian society, and the dissatisfaction, the conservative values, the anti-PT, frustration with corruption, if you combine that with an intelligent mindset like Marçal has, and this confrontational style, which apparently it's appealing for people. It's something that I can't relate to, but like as a political scientist, I understand. But that's what people want, and that's what he's giving, and this can be mimicked in any other type of race, at any point. All it takes is for someone to have a little bit more brain than Bolsonaro did. I just feel like in this interview I've been calling Bolsonaro stupid over and over again, but I think that's what Marçal is showing us, right? It's not a coincidence that there is this sort of theater, and I put that in quotation marks, that Bolsonaro is angry with Marçal and yada, 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 because he's creating coordination problems for the extreme right. I do believe that if the second round is between Marçal and Boulos, they will unite and all endorse Marçal. But at this point, they're having coordination problems. And I think that's happening because he's creating a blueprint that is actually more effective than the one that Bolsonaro created.
Now, before I let you go, I'd like to go back to what you talked about, the left not seizing the opportunity that is created by this lack of coordination within the right and the far right. And I mean, I'd like to ask you, why do you think this is happening? Because, I mean, I cover politics. Both you and I, we are political wonks. But I guess it is hard to look at the Boulos campaign right now and see any kind of brand that is not, I am Lula's candidate. Mm-hmm. And I mean, that formula of relying solely on Lula's brand as this larger than life figure, it might be running thin, right? I mean, of course, Lula is on his third non-consecutive term. He has a lot of clout, but not as much as he once did. Let's remember, he had above 80% approval ratings at the end of his second term. Now Brazilian society is much more divided. Also, Lula is on the twilight of his political career. At one point, he will resign. Retire. Do you see any sort of strategy that is long-term, that is not just riding on Lula's coattails? And for you, what are the risks of that?
I think the Boulos campaign is making the same mistake that the Lula campaign did in 2022, which is to present the candidacy in terms of, we are against the extreme right. They are not for anything. There is a lack of project that really worries me. And it worries me for the reason you said, that Lula is not eternal. At some point, he's going to leave us. And I think the future of the Workers' Party, to me, is completely unclear in that scenario. I don't think that there is a natural successor after Lula. I don't think Boulos is that person. I think that is becoming clear by the day. I think that given this lack of project, and I think also, like, for those of us who follow politics in Brasilia, I think that's why things feel so slow in Brasilia right now, that things are not happening or they're hard to happen. It's because there is not a project like there was in the previous administration. They were against the extreme right, but I don't think they have a plan for the country. And I see that in the Boulos campaign as well. And I think it's not a coincidence that he's losing ground in the periphery, where a leftist party should be stronger than a center or an extreme right party, right? I also think that they make the mistake of, Boulos has this professorial posture, and I think that doesn't bode well in parts of São Paulo. And I think that was the same mistake that, and to some extent, happened with Fernando Haddad as the candidate in 2018. So you see the same mistakes happening over and over again. And I don't know how the left is going to get itself from this situation. I honestly don't, especially if they don't have a plan, a project for the country that that cannot be summarized in we are against Bolsonaro, we are against the extreme right. That is not enough to win elections.
Beatriz Rey, thank you very much.
It was a pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Beatriz Rey is a political scientist and a columnist for the Brazilian Report. And if you like Explaining Brazil, please give us a 5-star rating wherever you get your podcasts. It takes only a second and it will help us reach a broader audience. Or better yet, sign up for the Brazilian Report, the journalistic engine behind this podcast. We have a subscription-based business model and your memberships fuel our journalism and keep us going and growing. And thanks to our subscribers, we have been able to cover Brazil and Latin America extensively. And for our work, we have won and been shortlisted for multiple international journalism awards. The World Association of News Publishers, for example, considered us the best news website in the Americas for a small or local newsroom. And in order to keep doing that work, we need your support. Go to Brazilian.report/subscribe. I'm Gustavo Ribeiro. Thanks for listening, and Explaining Brazil will be back next week.